Alrighty, I think we'll get started. Welcome to the Colorado Grain Chains Homeschool Webinar Series. My name is Dan Waldvogel. I'm the membership coordinator with the Rocky Mountain Farmers Union. Before we get to our speaker today, just a little bit of housekeeping. Welcome to the webinar. Would love for you to ask questions at any time. The easiest way to do that is to use the Q&A function on the Zoom platform. You can also use the chat box, but the best way to really get that question in there is through the Q&A. That all being said, this is being recorded, and we'll get this uploaded on the Colorado Grain Chain website and through YouTube to be looked at a later date. And then also, as a member of Colorado Grain Chain, you're also privy to recipes and other resources through the website. So on to our speaker today. We have Mona Esposito. She's also known as the Grain Lady, based in Boulder. You may recognize her as she was the presenter for our inaugural Colorado Grain Chain Homeschool, where she walked us through making and keeping a sourdough starter at home. Also, in the pioneering spirit, she is one of the founders of Colorado Grain Chain and served as the first chair of the organization. So Mona, thank you for your service, and thank you for your presentation today on fermented grains. With that, I'll pass it on over to you.
Okay, thanks, Dan. It's nice to be back. Welcome back, everyone. I hope some folks have returned from the original sourdough starter class, because today is a logical next step to some other things that you can do with your sourdough starter. But before I jump into that, so today we're going to be talking about making sourdough pasta and how you can use your sourdough starter to ferment pasta dough and many other things as well. And the reason for this is not just to assuage your guilt for all the sourdough starter that you are discarding or composting every time you have to feed your starter, but also to really dial into the concept of fermenting your grains in order to make them more digestible, more flavorful, and also to access the nutrition. So everything that I do, as most of you know, is 100% whole grain, and I use heritage grains or ancient grains because for me they offer the most, they're the most interesting in terms of flavor, and they also have an extra boost of nutritional value. So, and as well as providing lots of fiber to your diet. But the key really to unlocking all the vitamins and the minerals and the antioxidants that are present in whole grains is fermentation. It's fermentation that makes them more bioavailable to your body. So basically what happens is that there's an enzyme that releases the minerals that can get bound up in the grains. And so they are, in addition to breaking down the gluten to make it more digestible, they are making all the vitamins, minerals, and nutrients more accessible, therefore increasing the nutrition. And at the same time, the flavor gets heightened. So that's sort of the two-part whole grain to get the most nutrition, which is present in the bran and the germ, and digestibility. So, and then before I get too much into talking, I really would like this to be as much as possible as if you were in the kitchen with me and we were making pasta together. So I'm going to, do my little spiel at the beginning and talk about why we would want to ferment sourdough pasta, but I really encourage you to just jump in with questions and don't feel like you're interrupting me, because I want this more, as much as we can, even though you're not actually doing it with me, to be, more of a kitchen hands-on kind of workshop. Okay, great. All right, so I'm just going to start first by talking about the kinds of, I was talking about how I prefer to use heirloom and ancient varieties, and how I choose the different varieties of wheat that best suit the application, that best suit, whether I'm going to be making bread or pasta or pastry dough. And that also plays into how the varieties behave, but also plays into the flavor. And so there's a lot of room actually for experimentation based on what you're looking for, based on, in the example of pasta, what sauce you might be putting on your pasta. You might want a wheat variety that has a stronger, richer flavor. That would be maybe a hard red, like turkey red or red fife, that gives a little more oomph, that could stand up to something like a ragu, a meat sauce or something like that. And then in the summertime, when you're really trying to highlight, right now you might be highlighting things like asparagus and English peas, those kinds of things. You might want a more delicate flavor and texture in your pasta, and that would impact the varieties you choose. So although I'm going to tell you what I like to use best and why, I developed this color wheel here that gives you an idea of the different categories of varieties and their applications, and how you can, you on your own can play around, once you know what you're looking for in a wheat variety, whether it's, needs to be strong enough to make bread and develop the proper gluten structure and hold up for long fermentation, or whether it's something that like pastry dough that requires less gluten strength. You can play around with combining the different varieties. So this is on my website, and you can look at it a little more in depth there, and you can read about the different varieties and what they're good for. But I really do encourage you to play around. Once you have a foundation of knowing what each different thing you're making absolutely requires, then you can tweak it for different flavors and things like that. So,
Mona, can I ask a question?
Please.
So this is Andy from the Grain Chain, Colorado Grain Chain, and wonderful to have you here today. Thanks so much for presenting.
Yes.
We were using some white Sonora, some new crop white Sonora earlier this year at Moxie and Baking, and it just wasn't strong enough for artisan bread. And I know you came and you got some, and I kind of gave you the warning, like, wow, this new crop is just not incredibly strong. And
right.
You made pasta with it, and you were just in love with the results. So different varieties in different crop years can have lots of different applications. So maybe it's great for pasta or for cookies or for scones or for pancakes, and maybe not great for other applications.
Exactly. And that's what this color wheel sort of gets at, because in addition to having the three primary varieties and their attributes and their best application, there's the mixes of the two that when you blend, it brings out some other aspects. So for example, for the Sonoran white, I don't usually use the Sonoran white 100% when I bake bread, because in general it is a lower protein and a lower gluten quality grain. That can obviously vary from crop to crop and year to year, and with the conditions, the protein might be higher. But traditionally, it is a lower protein, less gluten strength. But for me, what it adds to my bread is it really affects the texture, and it makes the crumb more tender, and it just, and it also lightens up the heavy wheat flavor a little bit, because it is a white wheat. And so that's how I use it in bread. I use 30% in my bread, and I make sure the other 70% is comprised of varieties that do have the strength to make bread. But the Sonoran white, I love in pastry crusts and also in pasta. And sometimes I will do, you know, the traditional pastas, the handmade egg pastas, which we won't be doing today, but that recipe's on the website, and you can certainly apply what's happening today to that recipe. My mother's from Bologna, from the Emilia-Romagna region, and in that region, they do choose a softer, lower protein wheat for their pastas, which just lends this, you know, really silky, light texture to the pasta. So today, since we're doing we're doing a cavatelli, so it's just a water, flour, and in this case, sourdough starter pasta. It's a shape that requires, you know, it has a little more bite to it, per se. So I like to blend the kamut, which you can see here, and the Sonoran white. And the kamut is actually an ancestor of durum. And durum is what is traditionally used in the extruded pastas that you see in Italy, the ones that have been dried and come in the box. And because durum has a higher extensibility and it's more easily stretched into long pieces without breaking, so that's one of the characteristics, you know, that we really want in the pasta, because we're going to be rolling out the dough and then manipulating it to make these little shapes. But I like to include the Sonoran white to bring in that more delicate texture and that sort of light mouthfeel that it brings. Any questions? No? Okay.
No, not quite yet. You know, we've had a couple of folks trying to find your website and looking at the color wheel. So I just put the link to the color wheel in the chat box. Mm-hmm. And then it looks like somebody says the chat is disabled, which I'm not quite certain about, but it says I have a comment. I use 80% whole grain, high protein, alzada durum with a bit of bran sifted out, and 20% kamut spelt blend that is about a 50-50 kamut spelt.
Great.
That's a comment there.
Yeah, I mean, this is really about a little bit next level diving into, you know, not just reading about the different varieties, but getting your hands on them and just testing things out in your kitchen to see best, you know, best flavors for you, best texture, and that. I mean, you know, you need to know, you really can play around with the protein. It's not as crucial as in bread baking, where you really need to develop that gluten network and the structure, you know, for the bread to hold up through fermentation and the baking process. So it's a little less critical. You have a lot more wiggle room. So that's, you know, where you get to take this home, and you can start where I started and then veer away. So I have today, here's the recipe today. It's the same recipe on my website, but it's just half, because for the miracle of the TV today, and because the dough does need to be fermented, I already made half of this recipe yesterday, because it fermented for 24 hours in the refrigerator. But what we're going to do today is I'm going to walk you through actually making the dough, kneading the dough, getting it all set up, and putting it in the fridge. And then tomorrow, I will do the next step that we're doing today. So this is the recipe that we're following, and what, just in reaction to that comment, the split that I use for the flour for the different varieties is 60% of the kamut and 40% of the Sonoran white. And that's just the blend that I've come to like the most in terms of texture and flavor for certain kinds of pasta. Again, in the winter when I might be using a heavier sauce, or even in, you know, at the end of summer when things like tomatoes and eggplant are in season, if I'm making a sauce with that, you know, I might want to substitute something more earthy, you know, a richer, deeper flavor, something that has, you know, a little nuttier. So I might make it all turkey red, or I might do turkey red and the kamut, or you know, if I don't want it super strong, I would cut it with a little bit of Sonoran white. So again, this is kind of a fun. You have a lot more room with pasta than with bread. You know, the only things I would not caution against, but you know, it's the einkorn and rye that, you know, they have a little, their gluten quality is a little quirkier and things can be a little stickier and you have to mess around more with the hydration. So I wouldn't recommend first time, you know, using high percentages of those, and maybe just, you know, slowly incorporating more. And then just one other thing, emmer is also in the durum family. So there's a Ethiopian blue tinged emmer that has a beautiful color to it and flavor that works really well, you know, just 100% in this recipe.
And what are you looking for on your grind fineness?
As fine as you can go. I mean, you see I have my handy mock mill here. And so I use it on the finest setting when I mill at home. So whatever you would, from your miller, you would want the finest milling.
And thank you for sharing the ratio, Mona. We've had a couple folks asking, just saying, you know, they're having a little trouble reading the ingredients on that board. So if you wouldn't mind maybe, you know, listing the ingredients and weight for folks that are curious. And then also just to keep in mind that we should be able to get that recipe. I suppose if since you're willing to share it on the webinar, you'd be willing to share it on the website too, but we'll be.
Oh no, it's on the website. It is on the website. If people are having trouble seeing this, I can certainly lift it up, but it's also, you can pull up the website, and this was just so you could see that it was actually half of what was on the website. When I make the pasta, I usually do the full recipe, which is 500 grams total of flour, and that recipe yields about 7-ish quarter-pound portions. So that's sort of the beauty of this, is that you can, you know, rock out the whole dough maybe in an hour, hour and a half, and then you can freeze it. So you can have some of it the same day, or you can freeze all of it and just take it directly out of the freezer to cook it. So that's a nice bonus to have fresh frozen pasta anytime. This was just so I wasn't making pasta dough forever. So I didn't have hours of cavatelli, so I split it up. Okay, I think probably what I'm gonna do now, unless there are other questions, is go ahead and make the dough, show you what I do. It's really pretty straightforward, and then start making the cavatelli.
I'll sneak one in there real quick.
Yeah.
And just to mention too, I just posted the link to the recipe as well in the chat box if folks are able to access that. But just a question of where are you accessing your Sonoran wheat in Colorado? The participant was just asking, you know, they're getting their kamut, but they're having trouble accessing Sonoran wheat.
Sure. This particular batch is from the Jones family farm in the San Luis Valley, and that they have that over at Dry Storage in Boulder. Also at Moxie from Andy, is it North Dakota or South Dakota? I always forget.
South Dakota.
South Dakota, Bell Valley Ancient Grains. You can get Sonoran white from them at Moxie as well. Every once in a while, I get it from Arizona because, you know, this is a whole nother discussion, but you know, depending on where they've been growing Sonoran white, you know, traditionally in the warmer climates, like Arizona, California, Mexico, kind of migrated up. And, you know, you really do see a difference in the berries. You know, when they come from a warmer climate and are planted, you know, they kind of overwinter. They don't. They're in a warmer climate. You know, the berries are really plump and they just have a different characteristic. But obviously the goal is to support the local growers. So, you know, it's just, so that's where you can get in. It's just a matter of, like anything, being aware that from crop to crop and region to region, there might be slight shifts in the way the grains behave.
And I
Which
think
is cool.
I think Eric at Black Cat in Boulder has some planted this
right.
year, so later in the fall. You could probably, doesn't have a lot planted. I think he's got 8 acres or something in the ground in total between a few different varieties, but
and did Aspen Moon, I think Aspen Moon was, I know they were asking me for seed. I don't know if they ended up.
Yep, they've got a couple acres in too.
Great. So we have a few other folks growing it here. Cool. Good. All right, I'm gonna get started making the dough. Sound good? All right. Okay, so following the recipe, I've already milled my flour. So here you can kind of see, I really love the kamut because it has this beautiful, I don't know if you can see this sort of golden semolina color to it. So this is the kamut with the Sonoran. So it's pretty light, delicate, and it's pretty fine. I mean, I can't get the same, you don't get the same fineness on a smaller stone as you would, you know, who was milled professionally by Moxie or something like that, where the stones are much bigger and they're really able to fine tune it. But it works. So it's the flour. So even though I grew up with a mother that made the big, this is a little different than egg pasta, but I grew up watching my mother predominantly making egg pasta, and she would do the well with the eggs and fork it in and do everything by hand. I do a lot of other things by hand and like that to get to this step. So I have found that using the food processor just to quickly get the dough together doesn't really compromise the finished product. So you could certainly mix the dough by hand, and we are going to knead it by hand, but just to bring it together, I'm going to go ahead and use the food processor. So this is 250 grams of the kamut and Sonoran white. And then for, I guess you can't really see below, I just did the percentages. So the hydration for this dough is 55%. And that's really, you know, I arrived at that. There's not a real formula. You know, whole grains are thirstier than white refined flour, so that had to be adjusted. And then part of it is if you make pasta, you know, you get a sense of how the dough should feel, and you could add more or less water. You know, if you veer from this recipe with these varieties, you know, you might have to tweak the water, the hydration a little bit. And then the other component is 30 grams of starter, which ends up being 12%, which is, you know, a small enough amount. It's a good enough amount to begin the fermentation, and small enough so that it can be in the refrigerator for 24 hours and not, you know, get really crazy and out of control and over ferment. And you'll see when I cut it open, you can actually see there's really nice, you can see the gluten structure, you can see some air bubbles. It feels really light and puffy. And then, so for starter, this is actually just a whole bucket of my discard from a few feeds that I keep in the refrigerator, so that when I would like to make something like pancakes or waffles or pasta or pastry dough or cakes, I just take it out of the fridge, take the amount I need, and I add it to whatever recipe. So it's not at its strongest, but it was put into the fridge, you know, when it had reached its peak. And so it's still, you know, you can see there's still bubbles and activity. So it's enough strength to start the fermentation process for these kinds of projects. Okay, so 30 grams of starter. So I'm just going to take a little bit, and if there's any questions, I can take those. So I'm just weighing out 30 grams. And then the rest of the starter is going to go into the refrigerator. And eventually I'll do another set of feeds and I'll have more starter. And if I don't use this, I'll discard it. So I'm using, you know, the most viable starter, the most recent starter that I have to do these projects.
And a question, Nora, what is the hydration of the starter? What are you using for that?
I use a wetter 100% hydration starter. The sourdough, my starter recipe, and the feeds, you know, both for starting a sourdough, and you can watch, you know, you can watch that first video on the homeschool, and also for the recipe for feeding, what I do is on the website. So I just 100 grams flour, 100 grams water, and depending on the season and the temperature and how fast I want things to go, the percentage of the seed starter will change. But generally I do 10%, 10 grams.
Great, thanks.
That's a whole nother lesson, but it is on the Grain Homeschool. All right, so now the water, 137. So I'm just gonna simply dissolve the starter in the water. I basically put that board there for me so I can talk and remember what I needed to do. That was like a little too much. Okay, great. That's really all the measuring. I'm just gonna, you know, do my best to dissolve it in water. It is coming from the refrigerator, so it's a little bit cold. Hang on a second. I think there's is there salt in the dough? I can't remember. I don't think so. No salt in the dough. You can salt the dough if you want to, but I don't. So really, this is super simple. Flour, water, sourdough starter. That's all you need. And again, if you are playing around with different flours, you know, you might want to hold back some of the water until you know how thirsty, you know, the variety you're using is and how it behaves.
So Mona, I know that there is no white flour in your house, probably even on your city block, but
yeah, there are rules. I'm in a, you know, I'm in a certain zone that doesn't allow for that.
You're in a safe zone. There's no devil's flour in that area.
No flour on my block. Yes.
If folks are migrating over from white flour to a whole grain, it's going to soak up quite a bit more water, right? What do you think for like modifying recipes?
Say that again?
You know, it's going to, if somebody's migrating a white flour recipe over, and, you know, it sounds like we've got a bunch of talented, you know, home chefs here that are probably doing pasta at home. Any advice on kind of water changes on a pasta dough between a white and a whole grain recipe?
I mean, I think it depends on, you know, on how gradually you move into adding the whole grain. So I would say, you know, if you already have a white flour recipe that you use and you love and you already know what that feels like, you know, start with smaller percentages. And I can't believe I'm saying this, but start with smaller percentages of the whole grain flour, and just see, in which case you would only have to adjust slightly the hydration. You know, go in smaller steps to tweak it. And you can always, you know, once the dough, once you get the dough out and you're kneading it, you can always, some people use like a spray bottle, or they just have like a little bit of water in a bowl that they use, you know, to incorporate a little bit more water once they're kneading the dough, and they go, this just doesn't feel right, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So I would say gradually, or you just go whole hog and you follow my recipe, and you know, and you're set.
Hundo, baby. Hundo.
Go real quick. So this is just a few pulses until it comes together. That looks pretty good. And it smells really good. I mean, you can't smell it, but the whole grain flour smells so good. So to some people, this might, I mean, the might seem a little wet at first. But you know, you have this whole time from when you do this step to the next day when you make the dough, where you know everything comes together. I mean, you can't. That's the thing to remember, is that you don't right away see the full hydration, the full expression of the dough. It's not quite, you know, most dough recipes ask you to wait 30 minutes or something like that. But, you know, in that waiting period, much like with bread, you know, there's a lot that happens naturally with the development of the dough, just with time. Okay, that's it. And so this is about what it looks like. You know, a little bit like it's just come together. You can still see. And then I'm just going to knead the dough on the island for a little while. So basically when you're kneading, you just kind of want to do this folding. So you create a seam, and I go around the four corners, and you don't flip it over. You always keep that seam up, and you'll see, you know, as the more you knead it, the more you'll start to develop that smooth, silky texture. So this feels pretty good. So you see it's already starting to change and come together. So basically, you know, the kneading of the dough is you're basically, you know, starting to form those strands of gluten that give the pasta some structure and strength. I mean, you do need some structure and strength to actually do the next step of making the pasta.
So speaking of structure and strength, there's a couple questions about eggs.
Okay.
Suzanne says the recipe on your website calls for eggs and no water. So just asking, will the lack of structure the egg provides mean a weaker pasta, or is that just working out those gluten strands, or how does that work?
You know, I mean, the eggs definitely add more protein, which can translate to more gluten strength and structure, but it's also just a different kind of pasta. So, and so no, I mean, the kneading and the water provide enough strength. Okay, can everyone see what I'm doing? Seeing how it's making these folds as I go around, and it's keeping the top nice and rounded. So I'm basically just going around each four sides and pushing with the heel of my hand and sort of rolling the top to create tension. Did I answer that question completely enough?
I think so. And then also there's just a note too that there's 2 recipes on the website, so folks might be.
Oh yes, so there is an egg pasta recipe, and then there's this cavatelli recipe. And you can make orecchiette with this. You know, kind of depends what tools you have. Cavatelli is kind of the easiest with these boards. You know, what you see in the boxes at the market, you know, they use an extruder to put the dough through the extruder to make all those different shapes. So, you know, you definitely have some limitations at home with the shapes that you can make with just a flour water pasta. Any other questions?
Sure. Eric was asking, if we don't already have a kamut flour but have something like spelt on hand, how would that translate with this recipe?
Spelt could work. You know, spelt has good extensibility. It has good gluten strength also. I would say just give it a try. And you could use all the same percentages. And if you wanted, you could back off a little bit on the water. Even, you know, you don't have to wait until this step to see how it's hydrated. When you still have it in the processor and you're pulsing, you know, you can see how it comes together. And if it looks like it's too dry, then you just add a little bit more water. Or if it, or you don't add more water if it seems like it's coming together. You know, you just don't want to overwork it too much in the processor. The processor is just to bring everything together.
So one question, just a live play-by-play. Can you describe how the pasta feels at this point? I run into my pasta turning out too dry.
Yeah, this feels really nice and moist. And I have to say, overall, with the starter, I mean, you're not really feeling the effects of the starter yet. But definitely with the final dough after it ferments. So it feels, so you see, it's slightly sticky because it is sticking to my hands a little, but I don't have any flour on the marble, and I haven't added any flour to this, and I won't. So I don't know. Some people say it's supposed to feel like a baby's bottom. I don't know if you've heard that before. You know, smooth. That's when you know you're kind of done kneading it. And that's also, I mean, it's really hard to, that's why it's, you know, when you do these things virtually, it's hard to convey what something should feel like. It's, you know, it's really, it's a touch thing. So it just requires you not giving up the first time. And since there are so few ingredients, you know, you really know what it is you need to tweak.
And Suzanne was asking, could you use a stand mixer with a dough hook to knead the dough?
I don't know. I mean, you could, but you all, I think this, you know, really, if you want to know how your dough is supposed to feel, this is not that hard. And, you know, it's one of the pleasures of working with flour and water and starter is the sensory part of it. You know, it's harder to know when to stop. You don't really, you know, it's harder to see the shape that it's taking. You know, right now because it's always seam side up, I'm able to fold and create a certain amount of tension. So I think I'm done. Feels pretty good. Kind of silky. It's not wet, right? Not sticking to it. And that's it. And then so that's the before. And so after this step, I'm just going to wrap it in plastic wrap. So you can see it actually has increased a bit in volume. And you'll see when I open it up inside, it does look a lot different than a traditional pasta dough. And look, it has a little spring back. That doesn't quite have that. It shouldn't. And so this will get wrapped and go in the refrigerator, you know, minimum of 12. You could do 24. So let me just get this in the refrigerator. Actually, I don't do that. I'll do that after. There's that. And now we have the final dough. Any questions on that part before I move into the cavatelli?
Just going back a tiny bit. Michelle was asking, after adding the water, do you let it sit normally to hydrate the flour, or do you start to work with it immediately?
No, I start to work with it immediately.
Okay.
It's going to have a really long fermentation resting period in the refrigerator. So the resting, the waiting, the hydrating is really the period prior to making your pasta shape, and you're going to have a nice long rest in there.
Even going back a little farther, what is the lifespan / shelf life of discarded starter in the fridge?
Not too long. Let me think about that. Andy, are you on the call there still?
Once you see a weird blue liquid start to come out of it, or different colors of mold, it usually lasts about a week in the fridge as it continues to sort of acidify. The bacteria, raises a little bit, and the wild yeast dies off a little bit, and it becomes very sleepy and tired and acidic, right, and unable to make bread that has a lot of that will rise well. And you kind of pour off that liquid, and make sure it doesn't seem too scary. Luckily, there's some kind of natural pH stuff built in there that it likely won't become a pathogen. But you can just feed it again, or if you catch it before it gets too funky, just pour some into your pancake batter for a nice flavor, or your waffle mix, or whatever else. But its ability to leaven gets pretty compromised after about a week without a good feeding.
Sure. So this discard is from today's Wednesday, Sunday. So this is all from Sunday, and it still has bubbles. It still seems pretty active, and like Andy said, I wouldn't use that for my bread, but I could certainly use it for my pasta and cakes and pastries that don't need as much leavening power. Mostly we're looking for the enzymes to just break down the proteins, the gluten, to make it more digestible. Okay, I'm going to cut into this. I'll cut right into the middle just so you can see. So can you see how nice and airy there? Pretty different from what a traditional pasta dough would look like. So for making cavatelli, you don't need a lot. You need one of these cute little gnocchi boards. Just, a standard, pretty stiff butter knife. I have some flour just to dust on the board so that when I roll the cavatelli, they don't stick. So actually, some more. I'm just gonna put this in. Okay, so you just basically, I don't know if anyone has made gnocchi before. These aren't gnocchi, but you kind of do a similar thing. You cut off a piece of your dough. I just want to keep this moist while I'm working. And then you just roll it out into a nice long strand. And the idea is to sort of move from the center outward with even pressure. And so this is really where the different qualities of the variety you choose come into play, because you do need a certain amount of extensibility and structure to be able to hold up to manipulating the dough. But it feels really nice and smooth and silky. It's easy to roll out even cold. And I have had this out for most of the class. Normally I would take it out right before I start, because I don't want too much, even though it's been 24 hours, I don't want too much fermentation to go on when the dough is in a warmer temperature. So I'm just going for, pretty thin, as even as you can. But sometimes I just cut it in half because I'm running out of room. Any questions?
Well, yeah, we got one in terms of nutritional value, or I suppose even digestibility.
Yep.
Just asking, is there a difference between sprouting one's grains versus using a starter for the purpose of fermentation?
It's basically the same process. So, when you sprout your grains, you're starting germination, which does that same process of releasing phytase, which is an enzyme, and that releases the bound minerals. So it's just it's equally terrific. So if you have sprouted grains, they do the same job as using the sourdough starter in the pasta. So maybe the sourdough starter but sprouted grains, actually, the flavor is also enhanced with sprouted grains. So if you had access to a sprouted, the thing is, if you're doing that at home, it's a little trickier because you would be sprouting your grains and then you'd have to really dry your grains and mill them. But if you can, there are sources for sprouted flour. If you can get a hold of those, or you have those, you don't have a sourdough starter, that is another way to achieve the same nutrition and flavor. Okay, so we have a little flour. I'm just gonna throw a little flour on the board, and then I just cut off. What can you see? Just a little. You try to be consistent, but I'm not always. And so you just put it on the board, and you keep the knife, pretty parallel to the board, flat, and you just provide this even pressure and roll it towards you, and that's it. Boom. You just do that over and over again. But it's great, if you have kids, it's a fun thing to do with kids. And if you have more than one person in the house, it goes pretty quickly.
So one other question, going a
Yeah.
little more broad here too. Marianne is asking, what about making something like edamame pasta or using items that aren't grain? Do you have any insight there?
I don't know. I'm the grain lady. I don't know too much about it. Just so no grain, just edamame, like an edamame flour.
Yeah, that's the question we got from Marianne.
Yeah, Marianne, I don't really have experience with that. I mean, you'd have to treat it like I was talking about with the varieties, the different varieties of wheat flour, and really understand. We went over a little bit what is necessary, to create pasta in terms of strength and elasticity. But you have to dive into all those different aspects of, well, what would the hydration be to know how that would work. So the short answer is I don't have a lot of experience with that.
But you could mess with your liquid, right, and do beet or spinach or juiced spinach for color, or fun stuff like that.
Totally add those things in, right?
Maybe edamame juice.
Sure. I just was unclear if she was asking edamame as a substitute for wheat flour.
Mm-hmm.
Was that part of the question?
Well, that was the question we had, but there was an addition to it, just saying places like Costco sell 100% edamame pasta. Hard to believe. So
100%? No, nothing else in there? No, like weird binder?
that's I guess what Marianne is saying. So yeah, I mean, maybe it's something to experiment with as far as how that pulls itself together.
Yeah, I mean, edamame is a legume, and legumes have protein, so it makes sense. I mean, that's all this is the protein. I don't know, I don't know enough about beans and what happens, bean flour, what happens on the science end when you add water to legumes, but when you add water to wheat, to the proteins in wheat, I mean, that's all that gluten is. Gluten forms when you add water to protein. So it's an interesting question, and it's worth looking into actually what the process is. What happens to legumes when you add water? What happens to the protein? And then you could apply that to what happens when you do that with wheat and when you make pasta.
So one other question just about
Yep.
Different shapes and sizes. Can this recipe be used to make any shape or strand, or is it specific more to like a smaller pasta shape?
I think it just depends on what you're capable of doing in terms of tools. So, you'd have to find comparable yes, it could apply. What you would need to do is look at, because in different regions throughout Italy, there are all different kinds of shapes and that are made just, without eggs, with flour and water. So the best rule of thumb is to do a little research on that end and find a recipe that is similar, that's water-based. And you could certainly, it's more the tools needed to do things than anything else, that affect what shape you make. This is really pretty easy. It doesn't require a lot of tools. I haven't really gotten good at the cavatelli, but so it could be longer. There's some, trying to think, there's some pasta, in the southern part of, in Naples, that just uses flour and water. So yeah, yes, you could. I would start with whatever that recipe is, look at the recipe that has the white flour and adapt it, just make that shape. Just follow the rules for making that shape with the same recipe.
Mona, that looks so satisfying.
It is. It's actually very meditative, and it really doesn't take that long. That's it.
One question that Bev was asking was, do you have any suggestions of where you can buy that board, where you can find it?
If you're in Boulder, Peppercorn has them. That's where I got mine. I'm not super into Amazon, so I'm not going to tell you to go on Amazon and buy it. Any kitchen store. It's called a gnocchi board. That's the most common, GNOCCHI. That's the way it's most commonly referred to as.
So speaking of gnocchi, Michelle's asking, the way that you're cutting and rolling the pasta, is that the same way you kind of make gnocchi, or is it rolled in a different direction? Or I don't know if you have time to do that.
Yeah. My mother makes gnocchi a different way. She doesn't even really use a board. And gnocchi is potato and flour. That's the recipe I grew up with. It's not really easy to do without another binder. So you see a lot of recipes that have egg in it or ricotta. It's harder to get the ratios correct, the moisture and the starches when it's just potato and flour, so it takes a little more tweaking. And I have to tell you, my mother was quite alarmed when I asked her to try to do it with whole wheat flour, but we made it work. And she's a great example, or just the great example is if you already have experience making something, then you know what it's supposed to look like, so you're not completely in the dark about changing to a whole flour and how it should behave. My mother just uses a fork. She doesn't use a gnocchi board. She just takes a fork and shapes it that way. But I'm sure you could use the gnocchi board to make gnocchi.
Wonderful. Well, we are at the end of our hour. Is there anything else you'd like to enrich us with today, Mona?
No, I would encourage you to get out to your farms and get your, the local produce right now is amazing. And, fresh pasta is just a great canvas for all the really bright flavors that are happening right now. locally out in our gardens and our local farms.
That's great. Well, thank you so much today for your contribution, Mona, and thank you to all of you for tuning in. You can learn more at coloradograinchain.com. You can also learn more about the Grain Lady at Mona's website, thegrainlady.com as well. And yeah, keep an eye out. We have upcoming speakers for the Colorado Grain Chain Homeschool webinar sessions. So thank you again. And yeah, there's a place for you in the grain chain. So thanks for being part of it. Thanks a lot, Mo.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks. Bye.